On the morning of the 31st of July 1914, the London Stock Exchange did something it had never done in its history. It locked its doors. The institution had opened in its formal, constituted form in 1801. In the 113 years since, through the Napoleonic Wars, through the Crimea, through every panic and failure and continental revolution, it had never shut. Not for an afternoon, not for a holiday. The exchange that handled roughly a third of all the securities on the planet simply stopped, and it would not reopen for ordinary business until the 4th of January the following year. 5 months of silence in the building that priced the world. Now notice the date, because it is the whole point, and it is the part you were never taught. The 31st of July. Britain would not declare war on Germany until the night of August 4th, 5 days later. So the most powerful financial market on earth shut down before its own country entered the war. And it did not shut down out of caution. It shut down because it was, by any ordinary reading of its books, about to fail. 8 of the great London acceptance houses, the firms that guaranteed the bills of exchange financing world trade, were carrying a combined shortfall of around £50 million. Against that, the Bank of England had roughly £26.5 million in gold reserves. Less than half, and that was the reserve for everything. The bank rate had been 3% on the 29th of July. On the 31st, it went to 8. On the 1st of August, it went to 10, a level not seen since 1866. Rates like that are not policy. They are a distress signal. Over 3 days, the bank paid out about £6 million in gold to people who no longer wanted paper. On the August 2nd, the government declared a general moratorium on bills of exchange and extended the bank holiday by 3 extra days, producing the longest closure of British banks in the country's history. When they reopened on August 7th, there was no panic. That absence is worth a moment, because it was not luck. A run happens when depositors believe the bank will run out before they get there. The moratorium and the emergency notes together removed both halves of that belief. Nobody could be forced to pay, and there was now paper available to pay with. The cost of that reassurance was paid elsewhere, on the Bank of England's balance sheet, in a form the public never saw. But there was a rescue. The Bank of England took roughly £120 million of unsellable bills onto its own books, a figure equal to something like 40% of all government spending at the time. And there was one more improvisation, which I find the most telling detail of the entire crisis. The Treasury needed small denomination notes immediately because the gold sovereign was vanishing into people's pockets. So it issued emergency £1 notes, and it printed the first of them on paper intended for postage stamp. Because that was the paper available. The richest empire in the history of the world went to war with a currency printed on stamp stock. And that improvisation tells you something specific about what was happening in people's houses, not just in the banks. Britain in 1914 was a country where ordinary large transactions still happened in gold. The sovereign was a coin you carried. The smallest banknote the Bank of England issued was £5, a sum most working households would never hold at once. So when confidence broke in the last week of July, people did the rational thing. They took their gold and kept it, which meant the country simultaneously needed to stop paying out gold and needed something for people to use instead, in denominations that had never existed on paper before. Hence the emergency £1 and 10-shilling notes, drawn up in days, signed by the permanent secretary to the Treasury, John Bradbury, whose name they carried for the rest of their lives. Those notes were the moment the British public stopped using metal and started using a promise. It was announced as temporary. Britain would not return to a gold standard until 1925, and would abandon it again 6 years later. Nothing in monetary history is as permanent as an emergency measure. And the sequence matters more than the sentiment. The gold standard did not end because economists changed their minds about it. It ended because a Tuesday came when the Treasury needed small notes and did not have 3 months to argue about the principle. So here's the question this video exists to answer. Everybody knows the diplomatic story of 1914. The archduke, the ultimatum, the blank check, the railway timetables. Almost nobody asks the other question. What did the money know, and when did it know it? The answer is going to surprise you, and it points in the opposite direction from where most people expect. Let me be very precise about what I am claiming, because there's a version of this story that lives in a much darker corner of the internet, and I am not going to sell you that one. I am not going to tell you that bankers caused this war. I am not going to tell you that a small group of financiers engineered it, profited from it, or wanted it. The evidence says the reverse, and I will show you the reverse in detail in a few minutes. Here is what I'm claiming instead, and it has 3 parts. Money does not explain why the war began. On that, the historians are close to unanimous, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to make a better story. Money does explain the shape the war was expected to take. And money explains, more or less completely, the world that came out the other end. Along the way, I'm going to have to correct 2 things that you have probably been told that I believed myself when I started, and that you will hear repeated confidently in almost every documentary on this subject. One of them is about a book that sold 2 million copies. The other is about whether anybody expected a long war. Start with the crisis itself, because the timing of it is evidence. The assassination at Sarajevo happened on June 28th. For most of the following month, the London markets did essentially nothing. No collapse, no flight to gold. The City of London, the best-informed financial community in existence, sat through 4 weeks of a European crisis and did not price a European war. Then, on the 23rd of July, Austria-Hungary delivered its ultimatum to Serbia, and the machine came apart in 8 days. Between the 23rd and the 27th, London banks began calling in their loans and hoarding gold. On the 26th, the exchanges in Vienna and Budapest closed. Brussels went. Then Amsterdam, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Montreal, Rome. The Berlin exchange cut its final session short on the 30th, after Russia announced general mobilization. Then London on the 31st, and New York the same day. Now, why did it fail so fast? Because of what London actually was. We tend to picture pre-war London as a place where rich men owned things. That is not what made it powerful. What made it powerful was that London guaranteed other people's promises. A merchant in Argentina shipping grain to Hamburg did not know the Hamburg buyer. So a London acceptance house put its name on the bill, and everybody in the chain trusted the London name instead. That signature was the load-bearing wall of world trade, and there were perhaps 20 firms holding it up, which means the system had a specific fragility. It was not exposed to any one country. It was exposed to the possibility that debts might stop crossing borders at all. When Austria issued its ultimatum, everyone holding a bill payable in a country about to be at war understood at once that it might never be paid. And since those bills were the collateral for almost everything else, the collateral evaporated in a single week. And I should say plainly what a bill of exchange was, because everything above depends on it, and it has no modern equivalent that most people handle. It was a written promise to pay a sum on a stated date, usually 3 months out, for goods already shipped. The seller did not want to wait 3 months for his money, so he sold the promise at a discount to someone who would. Then that person sold it on. A bill might change hands a dozen times before it matured, which means the bill was money, short-term, interest-bearing, universally accepted money, issued by private commerce rather than by any state. There were hundreds of millions of pounds of it in circulation, and the whole structure rested on the assumption that a bill accepted by a good London name was as safe as cash. On the 23rd of July, that assumption stopped being true, and several hundred million pounds of the world's money supply became unsellable in the space of a week. That is what a financial crisis actually is. Not a fall in prices, a moment when a thing everyone had been treating as money stops being money. Which brings me to the thing this story is usually used to prove, and to the reason it proves the opposite. If the City of London had known a general European war was coming, if any part of the financial world had planned it, wanted it, or been consulted about it, the one thing you would expect is that it would have moved its money first. It did not move its money first. It got caught holding everything. And it was not passive in July either. It lobbied. The political scientist Jonathan Kirshner has documented the pattern across this whole era. Bankers are structurally cautious about war, not out of idealism, but out of interest. They want stable currencies, open borders, and paid debts, and war destroys all three. In the last days of July 1914, the city pressed the British government hard against intervention. It lost, completely, and in under a week. Then it shut its exchange for 5 months, and had to be rescued by the state with a moratorium and £120 million of emergency purchases. So when you next encounter the claim that financiers engineered the First World War, hold it against that sequence. They argued against it, were overruled, and then nearly went bankrupt. That is not what winning looks like. The villain in this story is not a group of men. It is a structure, and I'm going to show you exactly how that structure worked. Now for the first correction, and it is the big one. The version you have heard goes like this. In 1914, everybody believed the war would be over by Christmas because nobody imagined modern industrial war could last. The generals expected a short campaign. The bankers expected a short campaign. Everybody was wrong. It is a wonderful story. Historians have spent 40 years taking it apart. The German historian Stig Forster wrote a study of the German general staff and the short war illusion and gave it a subtitle you should sit with, A Metacritique of a Myth. His finding was that German planners privately conceded that a long war was possible, in some assessments, likely. Holger Herwig pushed further and asked the obvious follow-up. If they knew, why did they plan as though they did not? His answer is institutional rather than intellectual. An army staff that concludes war has become unusable has just concluded that it is itself unusable. Very few institutions can complete that thought. On the British side, Hugh Strachan has pointed out something that ought to end the argument by itself. Britain began raising Kitchener's new armies almost immediately. formations that could not possibly be trained and deployed before 1915 or 1916. You do not build an army for the year after next if you think the war ends by Christmas. So the clean version is dead. Here is what survives, and I think it is more disturbing than what it replaces. The illusion was operational, not strategic. The men who had studied the problem hardest did not firmly believe the war would be short. What they believed was that the opening campaign had to be decisive because the alternative was a war that no state was confident it could pay for. Read that again because it inverts the usual moral. The short war assumption was not innocence. It was not a failure of imagination by men who could not conceive of modern war. It was a plan built on a hope, adopted precisely because the realistic alternative was financially unthinkable. They did not fail to see the long war. They saw it, priced it, found the price unbearable, and gambled on not having to pay it. That removes the excuse, and it is the one thing the popular version of 1914 never says. But if they were worried about paying for it, what had they actually done about it? Here we get to a detail I cannot stop thinking about, and it sits in a tower in a fortress outside Berlin. After the defeat of France in 1871, Germany took part of the French indemnity and locked it away as a war chest. In the Julia Sturm at the citadel of Spandau, 120 million gold marks, sealed, held against the next war. In 1913, as part of the new army program, the Reich voted to add roughly the same amount again. A physical hoard of gold kept for exactly this contingency for over 40 years. And here is the part that tells you everything about how badly the calculation had been made. It was used. Immediately. In the first days of August 1914, the tower was opened and the gold went to the Reichsbank, lifting its reserves from around 1,700 million marks to about 2,000 million. That is the whole war chest, 43 years of saving delivered in one movement in the first week. And it made almost no difference. Germany's war would eventually consume something on the order of 150 billion marks. Measured against that, 4 decades of deliberate national saving bought a few days. The war chest was not too small by a bit. It was too small by 3 orders of magnitude, and unlike almost everything else in this story, that was knowable in advance by anyone willing to multiply. That is not a German failure of arithmetic. It is a European one. Every treasury on the continent had a plan sized for the war they could afford, not the war they would get. And Germany was not alone in preloading. Look at what the great powers had been doing with gold in the years before 1914, because the pattern is unmistakable once you see it. By the end of 1913, the Bank of France held gold worth something like 139 million pounds sterling, a reserve it had roughly doubled since the 1890s. Russia held the equivalent of about 174 million, having nearly doubled since 1906. Germany's Reichsbank held around 54 million, having more than doubled since 1905. 3 continental powers all pulling metal into their central banks, all through the decade in which they were also building dreadnoughts and railways. And then there is Britain, which did not do this. British gold reserves were not built up in the same sustained way, and contemporaries argued about it openly, a public debate about whether the country's reserves were adequate for a crisis. Britain's answer, implicitly, was that it did not need a hoard because it had something better. It had the market itself. It could borrow whatever it needed, whenever it needed, more cheaply than anyone. Reserves are what you keep when you are not certain you can borrow. That confidence was not misplaced over the 4 years that followed. But it is exactly why the July crisis hit London hardest of all. The country with the least metal and the most credit is the country most exposed the moment credit stops. The German plan itself deserves a line, because it was written down. A financial mobilization scheme formalized in 1891 assumed a short war ending in German victory, to be paid for by suspending gold convertibility, standing up emergency lending banks, and financing through credit rather than taxation. Not taxation, credit. Because the tax option was, in Germany, close to constitutionally blocked. And this is where I want to introduce an argument carefully, because it is a real historian's argument. It is a minority one, and I'm going to label it as such rather than dress it up as consensus. Niall Ferguson, writing in the journal Past and Present in 1994, and later in The Pity of War, argued that the German Empire's fiscal constitution helps explain the road to 1914. The Reich had almost no power to levy direct taxes. The constituent states guarded that right jealously, and the Social Democrats blocked the consumption taxes that were the alternative. A national war levy was only introduced in 1913. The consequence was that Germany could not tax at the level its ambitions required, borrowed on worse terms than Britain did, and its leadership came to feel it was falling behind Russia in a race it could not fund, which, on this reading, strengthened the case for striking sooner rather than later. And there is a small human episode that makes the constraint concrete. In March 1912, the German Treasury Secretary, Adolf Wermuth, resigned. His position had been that every increase in military spending had to be matched by the revenue to pay for it, that financial armament had to keep pace with military armament. He lost that argument, and he left. The following year, the Reich did finally impose a direct national tax, a one-off levy on wealth tied to the Great Army Bill of 1913. It was the first of its kind, it was explicitly temporary, and it was passed in the same breath as the decision to expand the army. Read those two facts together and you can see the shape of the problem. A state, powerful enough to build the finest army in Europe, had to hold a constitutional argument before it could raise a tax to pay for it, and could only win that argument once, by promising it would never happen again. That is not a conspiracy. It is a country whose military ambitions had outgrown its fiscal machinery, and which chose to bridge the difference with borrowed money and optimism. I want to be honest about the standing of that argument. Most of the major recent work on the origins of the war, Christopher Clark, Sean McMeekin, Annika Mombauer, barely features finance in the causal chain at all. They are arguing about mobilization schedules, alliance obligations, Russian railway programs, and the decisions of a few dozen men in 5 capitals. So I'm not going to tell you money started this war. It did not, and the documents do not support it. What the documents support is narrower and still worth knowing. The financial system was not a break on 1914. It was something to be loaded in advance, like ammunition. Now the second correction, and this one is a genuine piece of intellectual history that almost everybody gets wrong, including people who should know better. In 1910, a British journalist named Norman Angell published a book called The Great Illusion. It sold more than 2 million copies before the war and was translated into 25 languages. Study groups formed around it. It was, by any measure, one of the most widely read arguments of its generation. And what everyone remembers about it is that Angell said a great European war had become impossible because the economies were too interconnected, which made him in the Standard telling, the great fool of 1914, the man history refuted within 4 years. He never wrote that. Angell's argument was not about possibility, it was about profit. His claim was that war between advanced interdependent economies had become economically futile, that a victor could not enrich itself by conquest the way it once had, because seizing an enemy's assets destroys the credit system that gives those assets value. His famous illustration was that if a German army captured the gold in the Bank of England, the resulting collapse would cost Germany 1,000 times what the gold was worth. The whole structure, he said, would come down like a house of cards. That is an argument that war would be pointless. It is not an argument that war would not happen. And the distinction matters enormously, because the misquotation does a specific kind of damage. It lets us file the pre-war world under naive optimism, those poor innocents who thought commerce had ended history, and move on. Angell was not saying it could not happen. He was saying it would ruin everyone who tried it. He was right, which is a considerably more uncomfortable thought than being wrong. Now to the part of this story that I had never encountered before working on it, and that changes how the opening weeks of the war should be understood. Britain's first weapon in 1914 was not a ship. It was the financial system itself, and Britain fired it deliberately. The historian Nicholas Lambert reconstructed this from Admiralty records, and I should say at once that his interpretation is contested. Other historians of the period read the same documents as describing a more limited and less coherent plan. What is not contested is the documentary base, so treat what follows as a strongly argued reading rather than a settled one. In the years before the war, British planners had worked out something that follows directly from what we said earlier about London's role. If London guaranteed the world's trade credit, ensured the world's shipping, and carried the world's telegraph traffic, then Britain did not need to blockade Germany port by port. It could switch Germany off, cut German firms out of credit and insurance, deny them the cable network, and German commerce would cease, not in years, but potentially in weeks. Economic warfare not as a supporting measure, but as the main effort. The plan was to win by inducing a controlled financial implosion inside the enemy economy. And in the first hours of August 5th, 1914, within hours of the declaration of war the previous night, a British cable ship cut Germany's transatlantic telegraph cables. That was among the very first offensive acts of the British War. Britain's opening move in the First World War was to sever a wire on the ocean floor. Then, within weeks, Britain began pulling back from the plan. Not because it failed, because of what it did to the man firing it. You cannot freeze German access to London credit without freezing London credit. The same acceptance houses, the same insurers, the same clearing system. Britain was attacking a network it lived inside, and every blow landed on both sides of the wire. Worse, it landed on neutrals, above all on the United States, whose exporters, shippers, and banks found their trade disrupted by British measures. In a war, Britain would eventually need American money to fight. Antagonizing American commerce in the first weeks was an expensive way to be clever. So the great financial weapon was scaled back into something more conventional, a naval blockade with a legal and economic apparatus attached. Effective, slow, and nothing like the knockout that had been designed. Sit with the shape of that, because it is the real lesson of 1914, and it has nothing to do with archdukes. The most sophisticated weapon in the British arsenal was one that could not be used at full power, because the target and the weapon were the same object. And that failure had a consequence nobody planned. Once the financial knockout was off the table, and once the opening campaigns had failed to be decisive, every combatant faced the exact scenario each treasury had privately decided was unaffordable. They had to pay for a long war anyway, and here the roads diverge, permanently. Because there are only 4 ways for a state to pay for a war: tax it, borrow it from your own citizens, print it, or borrow it abroad. Every country used all 4. What differs is the mix, and the mix is what decides your next 20 years. Britain taxed hard, by the standards of the day. Estimates of how much of its war costs came from taxation vary with the accounting. The figures you will see range from about 18% up to a quarter. That sounds low until you look at the alternative. Germany covered under 14% from taxes. France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary essentially did not fund their running war costs from taxation at all. Now, that is not because German or French finance ministers were stupid. Germany's tax structure was the constitutional knot we discussed, and on top of it sat a political decision. The German government told its public, repeatedly, that the defeated enemy would pay the bill at the end. In August 1915, the Treasury Secretary promised publicly that no new war taxes would be needed, while internally the projections ran to 60 or 70 billion marks of debt. That is not a financing plan. That is a bet on winning, placed with borrowed money. And you can date the moment the bet was known to be bad. After the German advance was halted on the Marne in September 1914, the president of the Reichsbank, Rudolf Havenstein, acknowledged internally that the quick victory had failed, that is, within about 2 months of the declaration. The men running German finance knew, before the leaves were off the trees, that they were now funding the war they had decided they could not afford. They did not change course. They doubled the method, more credit, more borrowing, and a public assurance that the arithmetic would be settled later by somebody else. A tax on war profits did not arrive in Germany until June 1916, nearly 2 years into a war being financed almost entirely on credit. So Germany borrowed from its own people 9 times. 9 war loans between September 1914 and September 1918, raising something in the order of 98 billion marks. And those 9 subscriptions are, on their own, one of the best records we have of a nation losing faith. The 6th loan, in the spring of 1917, drew over 7 million subscribers. The 9th, in September 1918, drew about 2.7 million. The German public stopped buying the war before the German army stopped fighting it. You can watch the collapse of belief in a subscription ledger weeks ahead of the armistice. And where the tax and the loans ran out, every state printed. Over the war, the note circulation of Germany rose by roughly 600%, France by around 386%, Russia by over 1,100%, Britain by about 91%. There is your interwar period in 4 numbers. And there's one more consequence of the July crisis that nobody in London intended, which shows up on the other side of the Atlantic. The New York Stock Exchange closed on July 31st as well, and for the same reason, European investors were selling American securities to raise gold, and the outflow threatened to break the dollar. It reopened cautiously for bonds in late November, and for shares in December. But the closure bought the United States a few months of insulation at exactly the right moment. And once the European powers had exhausted what they could raise from their own citizens, there was only one place left in the world with spare savings on that scale. Within 3 years, the balance of financial power between Europe and America had inverted permanently. That story, the loans, the credits, and the day the accounting changed, is the subject of another video on this channel, and I'm not going to tell it twice here. What matters for this one is simply that the inversion was a consequence of arithmetic, not ambition. Europe ran out of its own money, because the last decision is the one that echoes longest. France, Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary came off the gold standard and stayed off. Britain and the United States held on, not out of virtue, but out of calculation. Staying on gold kept their borrowing cheap, and cheap borrowing was itself a weapon. By 1919, British public debt had gone from around 26% of national output to roughly 143%. That is the debt that Britain spent the 1920s trying to honor, that made the return to gold in 1925 so brutal, and that eventually shows up in every story this channel has ever told about the end of the British Empire. Now I want to be careful because there is a tempting line here and it is too neat. It is tempting to draw a straight arrow from 1914 to the German hyperinflation of 1923, and to say the war did it. The war certainly built the machinery, a state financing itself with paper it had promised to redeem out of a victory it did not win. But the straight arrow is not supported. Historians disagree sharply about the decisive factor. Some put the weight on the reparations settlement, others on post-war fiscal deficits and political choices made after 1919. And there is an awkward fact for the simple story, which is that the mark had substantially stabilized by late 1920 and early 1921, before the reparations ultimatum of May 1921. So the honest version is that 1914 loaded the gun and did not by itself pull the trigger. And one more caution, the important one. Everything in this video is about institutions, statutes, and balance sheets. It is not about a group of people. When you see the origins of the First World War explained by a secret elite, a hidden network, or a family, understand what is being smuggled in. The July crisis is one of the best documented weeks in human history. We have the telegrams. We have the cabinet minutes. We know the names, and there are a few dozen of them, and they are ministers and monarchs and chiefs of staff. There is no gap in the record that requires a secret to fill. So what is the real lesson? It is this. In 1914, the most advanced weapon any state possessed was financial, and it turned out to be unusable at full strength for one reason. The system it targeted was the system its owner lived inside. Britain could have tried to switch Germany off. It began to, and it discovered within weeks that the wires it was cutting ran through its own house, that the credit it was denying its enemy was the credit that made London, and that the neutrals it was inconveniencing were the people it would soon need to borrow from. That constraint has not gone anywhere. Every time a modern state reaches for the financial weapon, freezing reserves, cutting a rival out of a payments network, sanctioning a banking system, it is running the 1914 experiment again, and it faces the same arithmetic. The more central your financial system is to the world, the more devastating your weapon, and the more of the damage lands on you. That is not an argument for or against any particular policy. It is a description of a trap that is 200 years old and shows no sign of closing. And here's the part that stays with me. The men of 1914 were not naive. They did not fail to imagine industrial war. They had done the sums, understood roughly what a long war would cost, concluded that no state could bear it, and then walked in anyway, because each of them believed the opening move would settle it before the bill arrived. The bill arrived, it always does, and the thing that finally broke the empires of Europe was not that they could not fight. It was that they could not pay, and had spent 40 years arranging their affairs on the assumption that they would never have to find out. If you made it this far, drop a lightning bolt in the comments so I know you stayed to the end, for the German cables cut on the ocean floor in the first hours of August 5th. And tell me this, if the financial weapon always damages the country that fires it, why does every great power still reach for it first? I read every reply. If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, subscribe. It genuinely helps these keep coming. I'll see you in the next one.